see us in the group now, so we're good. Hey guys, we're live.
What's up?
We have one view. I think the view might be me, so that's cool.
Or me.
If this was a Sunday morning, that one view I would assume would be my mom.
Every time.
Yeah. So, anyways, we have people coming in. We'll dive into the book in a second. Let's just quickly catch up. How was your services yesterday? Everything go well? Nothing bad happened?
Very youth pastor of you to say last night. This is not a Thursday, Frank.
You're right. It's not a Thursday.
Old habits die hard. I caught myself yesterday because I said "you guys" like 3 times, and then I was like, you know what? Thank you to those of you who are joining us. I made it more senior pastory instead of saying "you guys." But went pretty good.
Yep.
Yeah, we had power went down before we were loading in, and so we moved the entire sanctuary outside, and I was ready to rip and roll on a sermon that I have in my back pocket. And then 1 hour before services, the power came back on, so we had to move the entire thing back into the skating rink to get ready to join the other campus. So I got all of my steps in by like 10 a.m. yesterday. It was nice.
And you're lifting, I bet, huh?
Yes, sir. Gains.
Nice.
Awesome. At one of our campuses, 3 cars got broken into.
Shoot.
Yeah. Do you guys in Tampa we had this? Do you guys ever see churches that have police officers like parked in their parking lot or anything like that?
We do.
It costs like some nominal fee per
like
per
off
hour
duty.
Yeah, it's probably an off duty officer. I don't know. I highly suggested it because I was like,
we have undercover cops that sit in our parking lot and stage stings during the week, maybe about twice a month.
They
stage
there's certain things.
They stage like stings, and there's been times when I've run into them in the parking lot and been like, "Hey, how's it going?" And they'll roll the window down and be in like full bulletproof gear, and I'm like, "Oh, officer, have a great day."
Yes.
And I leave, and then I'll like go watch on our security cameras, and I'll see there was one time where like another SUV pulled up. 3 guys in tactical gear hopped out, got in the car with that guy. They loaded up with a bunch of firearms and vests and then pulled out. And I was like, okay.
Wow.
They do the canine training on the back of ours. Oh, yeah?
Yeah, it was super dope. There was a hostage standoff at one point.
Wow.
And so there were like 40 cars and SWAT right outside the youth building at my former church. I was like, this is awesome. Except someone's about to get murdered. But other than that, it's awesome.
Other than that.
That's awesome. All right. Well, I mean, it's already 1:06 your time, 12:06 over here. I think there's enough people here to start talking. So, hey, we all read this book, right?
And or listen to it.
Oh, you're like one of those.
Hey, hold up.
It is
Does
best.
listening constitute as reading? Because I hear people say, I read the book, but they listen to it on Audible. Is there a yes?
I listen to it on Audible.
I listen to it on Audible exclusively.
It's 2021. Listening.
I also
is
have it
reading.
on Kindle.
Listening is reading. Okay, that's settled. See, we already accomplished something here today, fellas. I feel good.
So yeah,
It's all about those metrics that matter.
I actually listened to it, and then like Tim, I got some other people. Like my senior pastor wants to make our entire staff read this book now. So as Jeff said right before, my worship pastor is about to get fired.
I told you better warn him, dude.
No. But yeah, I got the book because I was like, I wanted to highlight some stuff and kind of think through it. But I think, over the past couple of weeks, as we've been prepping for this meeting, we've been talking about what we liked and didn't like about the book, kind of, high level. And I think it's kind of a consensus that there's some stuff that we like, and then there's some stuff that we don't like. Now, according to Andrew in the group chat, he abhors this book, apparently.
I don't.
He loathes it.
Hey, we promised we wouldn't reveal the group chat.
It's true.
I just don't think it's that good.
It's no longer safe.
Why? Why is that camera angle there?
What are you talking about?
We've got an intern with a handheld, and so he's just running around trying to get the best shots of us.
He's just standing there.
Yeah, so
He's got a really steady hand.
he's
Shout
got
out
a
to him.
very steady hand.
Well,
used to be
here
on-
we go. No, go ahead. What were you going to say?
I was just gonna say he used to be on The Office, but he wants to get into the church streaming world, so he looked for an internship and thought that Tim and I were that doesn't make sense.
Safety Harbor.
Love it. Well, hey, if you're watching this and you read this book too and you have thoughts or questions about it, I would love to put your input in the comments. Someone's like breathing really loud into their microphone. I'm like, I hear a lot of like breathing or whatever. Anyways,
I think that's Florida.
Bunch of you mouth breathers over there.
This is what happens when we're live. We don't get to edit out the bad parts of our.
We just walked 3 whole blocks and it's like 84 degrees outside.
I'm sweating.
So that also just might be the air conditioning that you're hearing because it's very hot here.
Yep. Okay, sounds good. But hey, if you read this book or love your questions or responses to our discussion, but hey, I want to ask you guys straight up, like, what's your overall impression of this book? What was your what did you like? What you didn't like? I kind of want some high level stuff, and I think that can lead our conversation to this first ever book club review.
All right, I'm going to jump in because this was my recommendation, right?
Like,
yeah.
When we talked about which book are we going to do first, I think I was the last to recommend a book, and then when we put the poll out, like the book took off, and was it even close between another book? Like everybody was like, yes, let's dive into that book. I think it's a hot button topic. I want to preface our whole conversation with mega churches are easy targets, right? And so I want to avoid that because I think Jared does a good job of saying this is not a knock at mega churches because there are many small churches who also fall into this attractionally driven paradigm. So this is not like, look at that big church. I knew you guys were doing it wrong. That's why you had so many people. This is not that at all. I was driven to this book by an elder who listened to Jared's Gospel Coalition talk at the 2019 conference they put on. So I listened to that, then I dove into the book, and then we recommended the book to all of our elders, our staff, and our key leaders who have now all finished. We have a retreat coming up on Saturday to dive more into it together as a staff. I've enjoyed it. I've really appreciated Jared's take on what's wrong with the attractional model, and I also appreciate that he hasn't gone out and said like there's nothing, like you can't throw away everything about the like there are some things about the attractional model that make sense that we can absolutely use and adapt in our context, but if we are not driven by the gospel, then there's going to be an issue because what we win them with is what we win them to. So if it's attractional principles, that's what we're going to have to keep doing to keep people in our doors. And we live in a culture of consumers. So if that is what we want our church to be about, well, then it will be. So can we coexist here? Like, I don't know. I do think that when we lean heavily on the attractional paradigm, our church is going to be all about how can I continue to satisfy my consumers.
I think you kind of just answered your point in the sense that attractional model treats church as a product, and every product has a shelf life, but the church doesn't have a shelf life. So I think to me, like you're really close to that. What I do like that the attractional model brought, because like you said, there are some things that it did. I like the fact that they learned, hey, it's important to have metrics to measure. And what I picked up from the book was we just might be measuring the wrong metrics. But how long do we go without measuring anything? And then, even throughout church history, we have been measuring, but it's been the wrong thing. And what I absolutely loved about the book, and I know we'll get into it here later on, is he showed you tangible metrics, how to measure grace in a church. Because our church, one of our biggest things we say is church is a place of grace. But let's be honest, if you ask most people, what does it mean to be a place of grace? A lot of people are like, well, that just means that you're overwhelmingly nice, or overwhelmingly forgiving. But what I like is he says, no, there's actual grace, and this is the metric for it. That was worth the price of the book right there for me.
Yeah, I would say in a similar vein as what Tim, you said. I appreciated that. This is a conversation that needs to happen. And, it's good to remember that the attractional church was one generation's response to what they saw going on in the church. And then I think we're probably all the way on the other side of that almost, where we're now saying, hey, well, that was a good thing, but what ways did that go off as well? And so I think it's easy to sort of. I thought he did a fairly good job of not painting the opposing view to what he's presenting in its worst possible light. Like, he's not saying that we should assume that everyone who's attractional doesn't care about the gospel and doesn't care about anything except numbers. I don't think I agreed one for one with everything exactly in this book, but I do really appreciate that he did his best, it seems like, to be charitable and to paint, those views in the best light. I mean, the lead pastor of this church is having this internal, struggle of wanting to do the right thing and realizing he hasn't been for all this time. And so that, it paints him in a light of a guy who really cares. He's not just there as some charlatan out for the filthy lucre.
I was kind of underwhelmed, like from start to finish. I thought it got better the deeper into the book that we got, but 2 or 3 chapters in, I was kind of wondering, like really, like this is what this is what I've committed to spending the next 8 hours diving into, and part of it was the fictional church, which I'm going through like my bookshelf, not like he went through his bookshelf and saw the different eras, but Simple Church, which was huge maybe 10 or 12 years ago, same thing. It had the First Church versus Cross Church. Here's these 2 different kinds of churches.
Communicating for a change.
Yeah, I would say
Yep.
every Andy Stanley book before 2006.
You better
or
throw that out
2008.
now after this book.
Well, exactly. Hey, I'm going to rip on Andy Stanley and yet emulate his writing style completely. That was dope.
Whoa.
Whoa,
Something's
guys, your
Just
audio
go
is...
out.
It's like some weird clicking noises happening right now.
Mute yourselves, Florida.
I mean, this is
There you go.
Jared C. Wilson's spirit saying "chill out" right now. I don't know what's going on. This is what happens when we're live, guys. We're doing it live. We're going live.
Hey, those of you watching that are small church pastors, this just feels like an average Sunday.
Yeah.
We
We can't hear you at all now. It's just like
Can't hear
weird
you.
electronic noise.
Just unplug everything and go with old school MacBook.
All right, Frank, go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, I do agree with what they were saying is I think one is I was wondering is the fictional church that he's representing, like, are people really that kind of like, I don't know if ignorant is the right word, but is it really that kind of like pendulum swing, right? Like I've never been a part of what would be considered a seeker sensitive church, but even the most seeker sensitive churches, I don't think they were just like, what is the gospel?
Yeah.
I think they were like doing their best to like be gospel
Oh,
centered.
Tim, your wife.
That's funny. to like be gospel centered and reach out to their people, but like they're just doing it in a way that's much more like sensitive to the seeker, I guess, or whatever. I don't know. I guess like I realize that my perspective is unique in the sense that like I've never been a part of a seeker sensitive church. Perhaps I've had a lot of friends who served in seeker sensitive churches, so that way like I have empathy for them or whatever. But at the same time, it's like I appreciate your preface, Tim, where you said, it's really easy to bash on the mega church, because I would say up until I entered into a church that was larger than 2,000 people, I would always see the mega church as this like, the Walmart of churches. They're just out here taking out the small guy.
Yeah.
And they have so much money they can throw around that they like, it's not about theology, it's about profits. And the profits is the people that they can get into their building. And I think that
It's really easy to be like, well, yeah, I guess if you want to not preach the gospel, it's easy. Like, it's so
Right.
easy to go that cynical route.
And it's so weird now because like the church I'm at, it would be split down. I think that if Jared was to like come to our church and be like, hey, this is how I feel, they would probably say like, your preaching is gospel centered, but your worship is too seeker sensitive. I know that because from our community, like, depending on what their background is, if they come from a super conservative background, they see our worship, they see the skinny jeans, they see what I would just say is excellence in music, right? And they would say, oh, they're just kind of catering to this to get people into the door. But then when you hear our sermons, we're literally going to be in the Gospel of John for like 50 weeks or something. They're going to be like, oh, this is the boring gospel centered preaching or whatever, right? And it's like you can't broad brush mega churches like that. It's kind of unfair. And I think even the biggest churches that they mention here probably are still doing a lot of good stuff. With that being said, Delmar, what you mentioned earlier about the gospel, the metrics of grace, this is really funny watching them. Stephanie's
Hey,
right.
can I ask Frank? Can I ask you a question? Though, what do you think Jared Wilson would say about advertising in the mall?
Oh, I actually. What's funny is his one thing about advertising is the thing that kind of blew up Epicos is he said, "Oh my goodness, churches have people that wear jeans." That's like he made the assumption people wearing jeans is not surprising in churches. I would actually say that's not true. I would say depending on what part of the country you're in.
Right. I was just that was kind of my point. Like you writing a book, you have to be pretty neutral on like geography and what works in specific areas. But
yeah, like in the Midwest, for example, here's a great example of this. One thing I've learned since I've been up in the Midwest is when you see the word Baptist, it's not Delmar's Baptist. It's not Southern Baptist.
No,
it's IFB Baptist. It's like the women wear skirts and dresses only. You still have clicking, guys. I don't know what it is. Yeah, like it's the fundamental King James only kind of stuff. So with that being said, that is like the peak of conservatism. Where like in the South, conservatism is basically just like Southern Baptist, which means probably the senior pastor's wearing a suit, but you could probably wear jeans and stuff like that. But like I'm talking about, like you can't even listen to Christian music because it's too devilish, right? So with that being said, if you have an ad in the mall that says Jesus wears jeans, that's gonna be a kind of a bold statement, because that's not a thing in a lot of churches up here. So
now, do you put that like outside of the Gap or like Banana Republic? Like, where do you put that ad?
our ad is it's actually it's a you can see the Starbucks from the ad, and it's not too far from the Apple Store. So
it is that way up here too, though. Like when
no clicking, you guys solved it.
The power cord came loose because
it was a loose power cable.
We have 15 cameras and.
Although Mike loved Andrew's dance moves, you're welcome. And Steph says Britney Spears started in malls, so I mean,
there you go.
It worked for Britney.
Go.
So
she's winning the comment game right now, though.
But before our sound issue died, the biggest thing that I got at the beginning of the book was when you were in high school and you had to write an opinion paper and you would create that straw man argument for, like, I go back to, you know, I grew up in an IFB church. My parents went to Bob Jones University, so I grew up where there was like a real history of interracial dating is wrong. And I remember in high school writing a paper opposed to that viewpoint, like, no, this is an ungodly thing. And my high school teacher, which was in a way more progressive church than I was like, what church are you coming from that this is a contemporary issue facing the church? And I was like, my church? What do you mean? That's kind of what I got reading this. I just felt like it was such a straw man argument against the attractional church model that I don't think.
Wait, Andrew, so would you say that church does not exist?
I don't think it exists in the way
like
that
you're saying. You think this issue is almost behind us pretty far now.
The biggest thing for me that I was like, what in the world, when he was talking about the way that he used to write sermons, and it was what we used to do was we would pick a topic, find out what we want to say, find out what we want people to do, and then go out and search and find the scripture. I'm thinking, what pastor is actually writing sermons that way? Am I so Christ-centered personally?
You might be.
That I don't think that even exists.
I sat under one of those pastors in college at the church, and when I was in Charleston, believe it or not. Yeah.
Wow.
Like I count one time.
And they do it in good faith. They're doing it in
absolutely.
good faith. They're not.
I counted it one time. He used 18 different references in one sermon one time from like 8 different books.
Yeah.
It was insane. But the thing I loved about the book, the most formative thing for me is it's the underlying message of who is the church for, and I love how he used the example of how there's the idea of a worship service, which this is a service that we render unto our King in an act of worship, versus a worship experience, which is a passive thing that I acquire for my own self. And those are two different approaches to the throne. One is what can I give to my king, and the other one is what can I receive from him. And I think the idea of the gospel centered church is you've already received the thing from him. That's grace. Every time you breathe, you've received grace. So now our job is to respond back. And I felt like he went kind of hard there because he even went into how Paul would refer to visitors of church, not as seekers, not as guests. He referred to them as outsiders. So I think there is something in that. I get how many of y'all are willing to jump on that grenade right now? Hi, if you're here today and you're an outsider, we want you to welcome you to here. How hard do you go into that terminology in this book? How did that
But to
land
be
in
fair,
you?
Paul is
Well,
talking to churches when he says outsiders.
No,
so.
that's fair. Yes, to be fair, yes, that's a good point.
Well, I guess the question, I mean, Jeff, it might be the person that asked this question the best is, Jeff, you have communion every Sunday, right?
Yeah.
So I think like that this is a question that I think would be the hardest one to answer would be for you is like assuming that there is a protection on the table for only believers having the Lord's Supper. How do you deal with that tension of outsiders, quote unquote, or people who aren't in the church, when you have an element of your worship service that's specifically only for believers?
Well, I mean, I would just first of all say that's based on a presupposition that everything in the worship service isn't first for believers, which I wouldn't hold. Preaching is first primarily for believers. Worship, I mean, in reality, an unbeliever cannot worship God. Without faith, you can't please God. So,
Sure, yeah.
Musical worship and engaging in worship can't actually be done unless you're a believer. So you can sing the songs with us, but that's not the same thing as actually worshiping, because your lips can sing praises and your heart can be far from God. So that to me is, I mean, I'm coming from a presupposition that actually makes that question kind of a moot point, because everything that we do in the service is actually primarily for insiders or for Christians, but in such a way that an outsider can comprehend it and engage with it. So when we sit down to plan a service, we're not thinking, what if an outsider is here? And we've had this, I may have mentioned this on the show before, but like we once had a visitor come and visit us, and their friend that invited them, which I think is also part of this conversation, that most of the people that show up at my church are coming because they were brought by a friend, not because they responded to some kind of outside invitation. Although those can work, it's just in my context. There's a whole discussion about that. But anyway, they came to the church, and their friend afterwards like debriefed, hey, what'd you think? And they said, I mean, it was okay, but it was weird that you sang about blood. And so it's like, we're not even thinking about that when we're singing. I was just glad we didn't sing There Is a Fountain that day. But I think we sang like, I don't remember what song it was, but it was
Power
something
in the blood.
Maybe Nothing But the Blood. I don't know.
Probably, yeah.
But it was some song that sang about, and there's, I mean, plenty of modern worship songs talk about that, and just assume that that's a normal thing. But if you have no church background and you're an unbeliever, that's weird. Why are we singing about a guy's blood? That's strange. So, I would make the same question about song selection as you might make about communion. What do you do then? Do you only pick songs that are the Jesus or My Girlfriend songs? Or do you pick songs that are, I mean, worship songs are for Christians to worship. They're not for, and people may disagree with me here, but they're not for unbelievers to like engage with. You have to first believe before you can actually worship. So that's how I would answer the question about communion. I mean, we just lovingly say, hey, this is something that we believe is only for those of us who trust in Jesus. And the Bible says that if you do this meal in a wrong way, judgment is coming. And we don't want judgment for you. We want grace for you. That's the whole point of the gospel. And so it actually presents an opportunity every week to preach the gospel in that small moment, and also to call, those who are already insiders back to the table. So,
Jeff,
we don't stand up before the sermon and say, hey, everyone, if you're not a believer, this really isn't for you, but you can go ahead and listen in,
No, Jeff, that is that entirety of what you just said extremely convicted me when it came to the portion of the book geared towards the preaching pastor as well. Like, how many times do you preach this whole sermon? It's fine, but you're always going to find that one place where, you shoehole in the gospel so you can check it off where, the book was saying, no, you start with the gospel, because if you don't start with Jesus in the gospel, everything else is just moralism. It's just you trying to perform well. And kind of what you just said, you can't worship without the Holy Spirit, right? You can't participate in really living out that sermon without the Holy Spirit as well.
Hey, I see a comment from Matthew asking he asked it a few minutes ago, aren't youth and kids curriculum that idea of taking topics and finding verses that fit them? My answer is yes, the bad ones are.
To be fair,
there are kids and youth curriculum that don't do that.
And I think like that's actually a good question in terms of answering the question, was like, what's the purpose of children's and youth curriculum?
Yeah.
Because I don't actually think, I mean, the book does talk about youth and children's in here, but the question is like, is there a difference in gospel-centered preaching, like in the main worship service, versus these Bible studies that focus on youth and children? Because I think if we're being fair, a lot of student ministry, don't get me wrong, student ministry can be incredibly shallow. Children's ministry can be incredibly shallow, and we're teaching moralism, and that's a big problem. So I want to get that out of the way. But with that being said, I think you have this unique privilege, or not privilege, might not be the right word, but opportunity within student ministry and children's ministry to base curriculum around topics and themes that are in essence catechizing our children, right? Yep. Where gospel-centered preaching, what we're talking about, is the main worship service. If all we're doing is doing what like the worst case scenario of this book is assuming is like, okay, people are worried about the economy. How can we talk about Jesus and the economy in a way, or, oh, the politics is really a big deal. How can we talk about Jesus for president as our sermon series? Like, that is, I think, a little bit of a difference, because I think in student ministry, you can preach gospel-centered topical messages, right? Like and I think that's the thing that, like, I think a lot of us in the gospel-centered world create these like dichotomies. It's like, you either have gospel-centered preaching or you have heresy, and that's not how it really is. Yeah, there is exegetical preaching that can be done gospel-centered. There's also exegetical preaching that can be done terrible, right? I've been in churches where it's like, okay, they stay close to the text, but their conclusions are not gospel-centered,
or it's just a running commentary on a book.
Right, you're just reading the commentaries.
It's not what I would consider gospel-centered preaching.
Yeah. Where in topical preaching, or and I think in this question, to answer Matthew's question more specifically, as a person who's created, and like a lot of us here have created content for student ministry, there is a way to have topical messages that stay true to what the text is trying to say, as well as bring forth the imperative of the gospel while still handling topics like dating, relationships, identity, anxiety, all that kind of stuff. I think the thing that often, the sad thing about student ministry and kids ministry is that it's most known for being moralistic, without realizing there's a lot of content creators in student ministry and children's ministry that are creating topical topics that are gospel-centered. Andrew, go ahead.
I think it is easy to do the same thing we were talking about with mega churches. Like, pastors do that to youth ministry. Like, they blow it off like, oh, all they do is topical stuff in there. And it's like, that's just too simple of an answer.
So much of the book seemed to be, it's either this way or that way. And my thought that I kept having while I was going through it was, it can be yes and. Like, you don't have to be unattractional to be gospel-centered. Like, the gospel is attractional. It's an invitation for all. Now, the whole come and die part, not very attractional. But
Jared makes this point in the book. But he does say
yes. But I'm saying
that's what happens when you listen to it and don't actually read it.
Yeah, when you listen while you're cleaning and driving and whatnot.
Ouch.
That's what I did.
But the idea that something, and I think he got into the issue was we're not arguing against being practical, we're arguing against being pragmatic. Was the thing that he returned to time after time after time. And I just think the answer can be both. And the brief few minutes that they spent on youth ministry, I also loved how in that fictional church, the youth pastor and children's pastor were like, well, I was wondering when you were going to come to us.
Already knew it.
Oh, and also, no, he was not the youth pastor. He was the youth minister or director. He wasn't a real pastor, just a youth pastor, not a real pastor.
Probably not ordained yet.
Probably didn't go to Midwestern, Jared. I see how it is. But just this idea that, what they're doing, well, we got to figure out the whole church before we figure out what's happening with them. Just, rubbed me weird.
I like some of the questions that Josh presented for us. He said, how does this book offend you? How did it encourage you? And what do you hope to implement in your church? I can tell you, I was a little offended with the sound bites from other pastors where I could tell it was probably taken out of context. Like, I don't know, like, I haven't heard the full Andy Stanley sermon, but he gave me one sentence from that sermon, and I'm like, dude, I don't usually appreciate the that could have been taken out of context.
Dude, I've said so much heresy if you just take one sentence.
Yeah, no, absolutely. But my encouragement came from the...
I bet you every pastor that he quoted was a white male, though.
Oh, wow.
Throwing that out there.
You would go there.
I don't consider myself to be a progressive person, and I read something like that, like when you get to the appendix, it's like, also, here's the name of 3 minorities who are doing things right. That was a neat nod that he threw in there in the appendix.
I think on the encouragement side, it was Edward's 5 deeper characteristics of a genuine movement. Like that,
loved it.
That is going to be the focus of our retreat on Saturday, is diving into those 5 deeper characteristics of a genuine move of God's Spirit. And I'm excited because I think that leads us into the practical side of how do we implement this.
This is the 5 metrics, right?
Yeah. Yeah. So growing esteem for Jesus Christ, a discernible spirit of repentance, a dogged devotion to the Word of God, an interest in theology and doctrine, and an evident love for God and neighbor. So on Saturday, as a staff and elder board, we are going to dive into this and what does this look like for kids ministry, for student ministry, for our worship arts, for our preaching, and we're going to just kind of have some fun and dream about what this looks like at Lakeview.
Yeah, the metrics were by far the high point for me.
Definitely.
In my notes for this discussion, I had chapter 3 metrics, super good.
That's what I wrote down too. Like, before we move on from it, I do want to say I just dropped in the comments a article from Timothy Keller, and this goes to your point, Andrew. It's from 2001, so maybe that shows you how out of touch this book is that I'm thinking of the same article. But it's called Evangelistic Worship, and he does a really good job of talking through kind of attractional versus not, insider versus outsider, and he kind of says at the end there's a third way, which he calls evangelistic worship. So really would recommend that as a good read. It's kind of a pretty short article. So, but yeah, I was actually really encouraged by the 5 metrics because, this is the first time I've heard of this book and read this book. But last year I felt validated because last year when we were working on vision, mission, and values, we had a long discussion about not wanting to have very specific goals for discipleship because of this reality that, like, you can't measure things like that it doesn't really work. It kind of works, but not really. And then, like, we were going back and forth, like, but goals aren't bad, but, if you don't reach a goal, then it kind of feels defeating, and that's not really the heart of discipleship. And so we actually ended up coming up with our vision statement, our mission statement, and then a 9-box grid that has values sort of statements in it. And the way we talked about it was that discipleship is about movement towards Jesus. And so we have 3 rhythms under each of our 3 core values that we look for in a disciple to see whether they're moving towards Jesus or not. And then under each one of those 9, we also have an area where, as church leadership, here are the things we're going to do to create the environments where we can expect to see people moving in this direction. I feel like that's very similar to these 5. And what I noticed about these 5 metrics is you cannot assess these from afar. Like, none of these can you just assess from afar. How are you going to know if someone has a growing esteem for Jesus? Well, you got to know that person and be around them.
Yeah,
and
you can't
to
hire a firm to come and do an assessment.
Yeah, and there's no, like, chart. You can't make a chart where you just check things and, like, you have to know that person. And there's never... The other thing I really like about these 5 metrics, there is never an end point to any one of the 5. Like, you can't be like, well, you're all the way devoted to the Word. Yeah. No, devotion to the Word is always growing. Esteem for Christ is always something there's movement. There's always movement. And
because
I really
in the attractional model, there is an endpoint, right? You finally got baptized, and now maybe you're tithing, and now we got you locked in.
And there's a class you took, and you're serving, and
it's always, it's very measurable. And this is compelling to me in that the church is known as the bride of Christ, right? Or so I think about that. Like, what if you tried to measure your own wife by using metrics like that? Woman, you cooked for me 5 times this month. You get a better on the chart. Woman, we had sex 7 times. You got like if we just measured that way versus what you just said, Jeff. No, actually, it's about knowing each other. It's about seeing our relationship develop. It's about seeing us grow. And just like that would absolutely destroy a marriage, I think that a lot of times when we do that with people, we begin to hurt the fabric of the church as well.
To answer the sorry, go for it, Frank.
I was going to say, to answer that question about what offended, what I liked, all that kind of stuff. I don't know if offends the right word. I rolled my eyes in the appendix part about like the gospel-centered troubleshooting, because I felt like that's when most of his opinions were, he was kind of treat as, no pun intended, gospel. You know what I'm saying? Like,
Yeah.
He had a statement about, and I was actually surprised by this because a lot of his like pals in his world do have video venue churches, and he's like, video venues are not good or not effective or something, and he has a lot of opinions about like what is a gospel-centered like music and worship and stuff like that. And so some of that kind of rolled my eyes. I was like, this feels a little more preference-y than actually practical or actually helpful. I agree
just saying that because he dunked on campus pastors in the appendix.
Wow.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, actually, his point about campus pastors was actually really good, because he said like the issue about campus pastor is like, well, what's their purpose, right? Like, what do they actually do? And honestly, like, as multi-site churches have been around for however many decades, it's still confusing. It's still new, and it's still being developed.
Jared, if you're listening to this, we did an episode about that. Go back and check it out.
Yeah, that'd be good. I agree with the metrics of grace. I wrote that down too. The other thing I thought was really, really good was the keys to shepherding in transition. I think is not just good when it comes to shepherding a church transitioning to be more gospel-centered, but like shepherding in general, like shepherding transition in general.
It's all of shepherding and all of pastoring is transitional, isn't it? Like everything we're doing is transitioning, hopefully, people from one place to another. But that part is, anything you can grow in that area is great.
But even like, even if it's not like, yeah, that's good. But I'm saying even in a greater sense of like, let's say you're like Andrew and Tim, both of you guys went through a big transition of leadership from the previous leadership to the new leadership, right? Like Jeff, the only jobs you seem to take are big transitional jobs for churches, right? like I think the 10 things he has here, where it talks about like employ plurality and embrace parity, show meekness and give mercy, over communicate, show your cards, operate consistency. I mean, like that stuff is so good, because how many of us have been in big church transitions where that wasn't the case and it led more damage than good? So I think like that chapter could be its own book in the sense of like how to lead through a big transition. That was really, really valuable, not just in the sense of transitioning a secret church to a gospel-centered church, but transitioning any church to transition was super helpful.
I think part of that too is like, I think I connect that idea back to not causing the little ones to stumble, like the show your cards thing. If you don't tell all the facts, and you have immature folks in your church who then are prone to begin to gossip and think wrong things, there's a sense in which you could be responsible for that as the leader, because you weren't just up front and kind of, to use his language, show your cards, so that there isn't space for that kind of like dissension to grow.
One of the things that I was very encouraged by was the concept that a church running 2,000 plus people would appoint their associate pastor with 0 lead pastor experience to be their lead pastor, because when has that ever happened in the history of churches? Like, hey, we're running 6 services and 2,000 people. Let's get someone that hasn't preached every week ever before to come be our new senior pastor. So I thought that was encouraging for associate pastors everywhere. That was, I thought that was great. And one thing that I was very offended by was when the senior pastor had to have the tech geeks make it so that his iPad could be shown on the screen. He should know how to do that.
Wow.
He should know how to do that. And I was offended at the idea that it would take geeks to do something that just takes a cable. It's not that
Can I
hard.
also want to say this. I read that, and I actually don't like that. I don't like it when pastors call something that they don't understand geeks.
Yeah.
Like, and I know this might be super kind of like almost like wokish or whatever. I don't care, because I felt like that was like, okay, I get it. I would say the people who are more technical than I am can help me with the iPad. And I also don't like it when, like, in certain churches that tend to not go deeper in terms of like word study or stuff like that, they often, when they bring up like a Greek word or a Hebrew word, they'll say something like, hey, this is for you Bible nerds out there. It's like, that feels a little bit like we should aspire to study more.
Yes.
Because this is something for Bible nerds and stuff like that. So anyways, I know that you said that as like a small pet peeve. That's the same way how I feel when we as pastors call things that maybe the masses don't understand as geeks and nerds. If it's not about Marvel, don't use the word geeks or nerds. You know what I'm saying? Like, I like saying.
What about the Master Splinter that Dell had on his microphone a few minutes ago? I'm just wondering where that qualifies.
That's a positive. That's a positive form of geek culture. I'm okay with that.
There you go.
But that also gets you out of shepherding people towards like that number 4, interest in theology and doctrine.
Yeah.
If you constantly say, oh, that's for geeks and nerds, it's the same thing I've been frustrated about in youth ministry. Like, oh, kids can't handle that, exegetical preaching and deep theology. Just give them this topical stuff. And you're like, they can handle it.
Do you remember that Stephen Furtick sermon a long time ago?
Oh, yeah.
He was ripping on Calvinists, and he says,
Yeah.
Who's Stephen Furtick? He basically said, like, people who, it was really early on. I think it was earlier on in his ministry, and he was like being kind of ridiculed by like the Gospel Coalition crowd, the Gospel Center crowd, and he called them gluttons for theology. And he was like, you sit there in the pews getting all fat and puffed up, and it's like, that is kind of the same kind of like bad interpretation of like what we're trying to say. Because I think he actually shot himself in the foot when he said that, because now anybody at Elevation who wants to grow deeper is now being threatened of, am I a glutton for theology?
Yeah.
Am I a glutton for like
Don't study, just serve.
Terms. Yeah.
Well,
We just need you to serve. We don't need you to study anything.
Yeah, that's one of the things beautiful about the book is that it really went into like, this should be the Christian life. It's the gospel. It's not the gospel isn't the sprinkles on the sermon. It is the sermon. And to what you were just saying, Vodi Bakum did. God, y'all ever heard the sermon where he talks about spiritual young men? And he was talking about how, like, a boy comes up in the church, he loves the scriptures, he loves learning theology. And what do we always tell him? Boy, you need to go be a preacher. And he's like, no, that's called being a Christian. Yeah. And we pigeonhole these people into being preachers. And no, that should be the passion of every single Christ follower. I kind of felt that vein in this entire book. I think the thing that offended me in this book, but at the same time was the most challenging, and it's actually something that's been on my heart and in my wall in my office for the last year, was the one line. And it was this, not only Paul, simply servants, busboys in the house of God, they are nothing. And ultimately that is our goal as pastors, is to be the best at being nothing for Jesus, because when we try to build our own platforms, it grows. And just look at megachurch culture pastors. I mean, I hate to say it, but look at the Elephant in the Room series that came out, 10 years ago now? I love that series, but systematically, over half of those pastors are no longer in the ministry, or they went through some horrible, like, moral failure. And I think it's because there's that little tinge of, yeah, you're nothing, but God has given you this platform, so you got to be something about being nothing.
And what's ironic in that is some of the pastors that did fail weren't the seeker sensitive pastors.
That's so, yeah, that's a good point.
It would be the guys that back in the mid 2000s would be the gospel centered people.
Yeah.
Who are no longer in ministry right now for some kind of failure or whatever. I mean, at the end of the day, this isn't a high five towards the seeker sensitive movement or anything like that. I think ultimately the vibe I'm getting from all 5 of us is there is value in this book in the sense of like, yeah, we need to figure out how to reverse engineer some of the pendulum swing that we saw from a couple of decades ago, but not go too far in the pendulum swing that we're like kind of just going in this like, left and right super far back and forth where we're speaking over people and we're missing opportunities where the gospel was reached by people who were going in that that seeker sensitive movement. How can we swing a little bit more towards the center in that?
I've got a question for Jeff, because Jeff, you're the
yes,
worship
we
leader.
take communion every week.
I know you do. So the one thing that I wrote down that, like, one thing I wish you would have gone into more was, there's the whole plot line with the worship leader, but what are examples of?
I felt for that guy.
Yeah, me too. I felt really bad for him, and he had to go to the cool coffee shop. I get that.
Yeah.
But what are some examples of worship songs that would be the gospel centered versus the attractional worship songs? I was like, dude, just like show me receipts. Put it in there, because that was one of the parts of the book that I had a hard time kind of understanding, and I realized that if you're singing Oceans every week, that might be an issue for some people, but.
I mean, there's a few different metaphors that are good to think about, like just categories of songs. I tend to still be really attracted to the early, like, Mars Hill music that was going on back in the day. I mean, a lot of it's really great. There's some of it that I'm not quite exactly where I was theologically, but I still sing the songs, But, like, so any old Dustin Kensrue.
Ironically, that's what Derek Webb just said when people said, hey, how are you charging $15 to watch you live stream an album from your living room when you say you don't believe that anymore? He goes, well, because I believed it when I wrote the song, so I'm still singing it, and I will still take your money.
I mean, let's go back to the old, like, the old Passion days, like that song, that old Charlie Hall song, Marvelous Light. It's like the gospel in a song, It's like, it's great. So that kind of stuff, you could sing it every week. So one of the metaphors I try to walk my worship, team through, and when I was the worship pastor, think about, like, and this actually came from, I think a buddy of mine. It might have been Matt, Frank, who asked you a question. But anyway, it was like the metaphor of like a well-rounded meal. Like if if you're going to eat dessert for your meal every time, you're not going to be healthy. So there are some songs, like I would say Oceans might be like a dessert song, in the sense that, like, it's not bad necessarily, but it's not the best thing to intake all the time. So maybe mix that in once in a while, but for the most part, sing songs that are centered on the gospel. That an important thing I think to sing about often, because of how much singing teaches us, is to sing about our own mortality and our death, and, like, to prepare ourselves that we're gonna die. And
so that would be like an appetizer song.
But give me songs. What songs should I be singing?
I mean, I don't even know the bad ones because I'm just so.
Because that's how I feel about their preaching. It's like, I'm so Christ-centered, I don't get what he's talking about. That's what you're saying with the music. You are so Christ-centered in your worship that you don't
even know what the bad songs are. I can tell you, we haven't sung a recent release in a long time, and that may not be a good thing.
I'll show you some receipts. You ready?
Yeah, I'm looking up my songs in Planning Center right now.
I don't know if you remember this. So me and Jeff took the same worship classes in college.
Not Above All, I can tell you that. That's not in the mix.
Well, that was the song I was going to mention.
Crucified, laid behind a stone.
In Bible college, we talked about egocentric worship versus theocentric worship.
Yeah.
And so a big thing is, like, a lot of hymns are theocentric. They're vertical songs about our perspective and our relationship with God and giving exaltation to God. And then there's egocentric worship, which is about our experience, like what from our vantage point. So like in Oceans would be egocentric, Mighty Fortress is our God is theocentric, right? Above All, to me, not only is egocentric, but it's also crazy heretical because it has that line where it's like, you took the fall and thought of me above all. Like Jesus on the cross is like, Frank,
but it rhymes. So
yeah,
if it rhymes, that's important, right?
That's all that matters. No, but it's funny because even if you think of, like, I've been listening, if you follow some worship leaders, they talk about that dynamic of vertical worship versus horizontal worship, and how when they make an album, this is broad brushing, so forgive me if there's worship leaders in here, but how they themselves are trying to balance the amount of vertical worship songs to the personal egocentric worship songs. And to me, it's like, I'm not a worship writer. I don't even know how to write a worship song. I would be a guy that would be like, hey, let's just sing the Psalms because I'm not that creative. But like, my thing is, if you're having a discussion of it goes back to what Jeff said in the beginning. What is worship? What's the purpose of it? What are we trying to do? And if that's true, then like me and Jeff used to joke about this in Bible college. Like when we do a chapel, we'd be like, hey, yo, let's play the bangers. Well, that by itself is already we're off of the wrong foot, because now we're just playing songs to make us feel good and jump around and like make us hype. Let's think about what are the songs that's going to give
From
God
the Inside Out.
most...
That was the song.
That was Inside Out.
The one. That was
jam.
the jam.
It was one of the jams.
Still is. Still,
I think
still
it's
is.
Do you remember
it's-
Sonic Flood? I Can Sing Your Love Forever.
Oh, yeah.
Over
I
the
remember
mountains
they
and
came
the
to
sea.
Charleston Southern when I was in a different part of the state. We took some students there for a concert, and I'll never forget. This is where we're in the middle of, I Can Sing Your Love Forever. And right before that song, the setup was, okay, everybody, right now in these next minutes, as we sing to God, you need to put up your rock fist. That's what was told to them. Put up your rock fist, and we're gonna sing "I Could Sing Your Love."
I'm gonna be
Forever."
honest though, I would have had my fist up though.
Bro, and
I look
my
down
little
on it
Nokia
now, but-
phone with a light. Yeah.
Oh, for sure. I think it's just a category thing. Like Andrew, back to your question. So here's a song that we sang recently. This is a guy named Chris Renzema. He has a song called "Son of God." I'm gonna read you some lyrics. These are very poignant, and I feel very centered on Jesus and who he is in the gospel.
I'd prefer that you sing me the lyrics just so I
No.
can get a better picture. Okay.
No, you should go listen to his version of it. Here's the verse 2 that just killed me when I heard it the first time. And this is what, as a pastor, I'm thinking, man, this is what I want my people to be singing and believing and taking in. And we sang this summer a couple times. We have heard the promise of a land where war will cease from among men, but not by presidents or trials. We have seen the greatness of our King, hope that all will be redeemed, but not by military might, but by the man who bled and died. And so this song is explicitly kind of smashing into idols, and it was on purpose. So that's the kind of stuff that I like to do once in a while. You can't do that every week all the time, or everyone's just going to be mad, and that doesn't help either. But I also think that it's how you view corporate worship, and I think the book helped us get there, that corporate worship is discipleship. And this is one of the things that I think the attractional church can actually help us realize, that everything you say, every word, every phrase you use, all of those things are forming us. So what the attractional church does get right is to say, hey, you should be careful with the words you say from the platform or from, in the lobby, because, if you start calling somebody an outsider, that might hinder them. Or if you constantly are talking about the stage instead of maybe the chancel, which is an old word for that, maybe that creates some wrong thinking. So
Or
those
the
are
altar
just,
if you're a Baptist.
yeah, or the altar, whatever it
Altar.
is.
And-
So what ways are you discipling your people by even just your actions and the way you do things and how you even, just the way you speak that you don't even mean to do? So I think that's where the attractional church is helpful in that they're saying, hey, everything you do is really important. You should think about all of it.
Yeah, and I mean, as we cap this out, to your point, Jeff, so much of us moving from here to there in regards to becoming more gospel-centered, it is about the forethought and the intentional progression. Because I don't know about you, but I think everyone who's been in ministry for us a while, where you're like, I know where we need to go, and you went there too fast. I remember I did that in my last church. I was like, we're singing, I rolled in there, it's a little country church, so we're singing I'll Fly Away, I'm like, wow, okay. So I came in there one Sunday and I was like, we're going to sing Instead of a Show by John Foreman. And I don't know if you've ever listened to that song. You should. That should be your homework for today, because you will love this guy right here. Would sing it every week in his church. But we got done and it divided our church, kind of like politics, because you had some people like, yeah, like all we're doing is goofing off. God hates your worthless performance. And the other people are like, what do you mean? God he hates us now? And I was like, oh man, year one worship guy screwed that one. So
Hey, but I'll Fly Away is a good song though.
yeah, man, you're just gonna fly right on away.
I'll say, I don't want to. when I wrote that paper, I wrote a big paper about egocentric versus theocentric. I went into that paper being super arrogant and being like, it should only be theocentric. Throw all the songs that take away me and I, and like I was so arrogant about it. At the end of that research paper, I realized like a lot of the Psalms are egocentric, right? Like a lot of hymns are egocentric. So it's not an issue of like, oh, if I start singing about my perspective, it's bad. It's ultimately like, what's the aim of the song for? And like, I think not to speak in broad brush terms, but like there are a lot of modern worship songs that are kind of going way deeper into like the experience of being a Christian and like kind of what we gain out of it as opposed to like the worship of God. And I think that is something we as pastors need to be involved with our worship leader to help curate the songs that we're going to sing as a church, that's molding and forming in us the character and the person that we want to see in the discipleship of our church. But it doesn't mean like there's a black and white line that's like, all right, these songs are great and these songs are bad, because I would actually say that there are good songs that can be done poorly, right? Like if like depending on what you're trying to say in the service and how you form out your excuse me if this is too like modern, the playlist of your worship service,
liturgy, that's what you mean.
That's right, man. The liturgy of the service. The songs could actually be good or bad depending on what you're trying to the diet, Jeff said, the diet that you're giving.
When they were written is almost completely irrelevant as to whether they're gospel centered or not. I just dropped another link in the comments for a curriculum called Liturgy, Music, and Space. Just something that would be really help you think through some of this stuff. It's aimed at worship pastors, but I find it really helpful.
Let's wrap up by asking this one question around the horn. If there's one thing that you took from this book that you want to add to your church or change in your church, really quickly, what is that one sentence thing that you're like, I got this from the book, this is what I'm going to maybe install in my church?
I'm going to go back through our metrics and with those metrics in mind and see if there's any tweaking that can be done.
All right, so if you're at
the
metrics,
reason that Jeff talked first is because we all were going to say metrics, and so now we're like, dang it.
He took metrics, so I'm going to say that we don't have to throw every attractional piece out. I don't know. I have friends, and Andrew, we've had conversations with guys who have said, well, an attractional church does that, so we will not do that. Yeah, and it's like we won't have a feather banner because, well, that seems too attractional, or we won't upgrade our sound gear because we don't want to come across as trying to be attractive. Like, that is such a dangerous mindset to be in.
That's like anti-pragmatism, which is just as dangerous.
Yes, absolutely.
So I think what I'm going to do is pull the rug out from underneath my worship guy.
While he's playing.
Yeah.
Delmar, do you have a certain or Andrew? I don't think, did you answer this question?
You know, the 5 metrics in chapter 3 were, of course, the thing that, like I said, Jeff went first because he knew that that's what we all wanted.
Yeah, you can't say that.
Yeah, exactly. So, you know, I will say this past Sunday we've been going through the life of David, and so I had finished this book, I think Wednesday, and was finishing my sermon up Thursday with the idea of, you know, kind of making a beeline to the cross, and it was really easy because I was at David and Mephibosheth, so that's an easy correlation. But just kind of the thought of, all right, yes, being expository in your preaching is good, and leaning into the meaning behind the text, but we're pointing people not to how we should behave, but rather to the grace that they have in Christ. And so find a way to point to the grace and find a way to aim for the cross.
That's good. For me, my lingering thing that I need to do is admit to myself that much of this book was me entering an echo chamber for my own, what I like. And I think a lot of guys, especially Reformed guys, this is going to be an echo chamber. So the thing that I need to take the most out of this is do it slow, like, because I'm a fast, hurried kind of person. I'm a salesman at heart, you know. So for me, I think I need to let this book marinate in me a minute before I just start pulling triggers, or I will just shoot up the room. So,
Delmar, wow, I'm like. That was super encouraging you said that, because like I felt the same way. I felt like entering this book felt like me entering into a very warm, cozy blanket of like everything I've already want to be heard, of like things I want to say. And so I think like wrestling with the fact that like I have friends who work at some of the churches that he's criticizing, right? And like and they're godly, Christ honoring, gospel centered people who happen to be working at North Point, right, or at Saddleback or whatever church that he might be criticizing in this book. Like, so with that being said, it's like I wanted to wrestle with some of the things where it's like, yeah, there was some stuff that's like yes and amen, I already agree with him, but then there was other aspects that were like I want to challenge with it. I think my Andrew, don't look back too much. I think if you're listening to,
I call that one look back at it.
Hey, if you're listening to this episode and if you want to watch it, go on YouTube or on the Facebook group. This will all be there. That was really funny. I think my biggest takeaway is actually that chapter on transition. I think like my church in particular has been through 2 major transitions, maybe now 3 transitions, and I think we get better with every transition. And I think this gives you kind of like a really good outline of transition. So that was really good. All right. Hey, thank you so much.
Frank, you said you have friends at attractional churches. Call them out right now. Call them out. Just kidding. Don't
do it. Oh, he was about to.
Don't do that.
No.
They know who they are.
Yeah.
No, they're great guys. And ladies. They're actually good ladies.
And ladies.
They're not listening to this.
Yeah, that's true.
Ladies? Did you say
They're
ladies? Because that's something that wasn't mentioned once in the book, but that's okay. I won't.
It's the Billy Graham rule.
That's
you can't
not
write
true.
about women.
That's not true. Billy Graham. He mentioned Jen Hatmaker, but not by name.
And the children's minister.
And the children's minister, who was already doing things right, but
He's doing it perfect.
Minister, okay.
Oh man. Ooh,
children's director. Children's director.
Hey, dude, this was good. So hey, if you're still listening, if you're still watching, I'm in the Facebook group. I'm gonna put the next book options for the month of March. There's already some really good books that are gonna be there. It's gonna be hard to pick just one. So we'll do the same thing. It's gonna be in the Facebook group. It'll be up for a couple of days. The one with the most votes will be chosen. All the book options will have an Audible version. So please join us for the next one. And then probably the first Monday in April, maybe we'll be able to do this again. And hey, thank you so much for joining us.
That'll be my birthday episode.
Oh yeah.
Oh yeah.
That's awesome. Until next time, I'm Frank Gill.
I'm Jeff Simpson.
I'm Delmar Pete.
I'm Andrew Larson.
And I'm Timothy Miller.
And this is Practically Pastoring. See you next week. Bye.